10 minutes after my sister sent me the message we had promised each other we would never use, I was standing on her front porch in the rain, staring at my brother-in-law through a half-open door. Tom's face was red, not from embarrassment, from anger. Behind him in the dim hallway of their quiet Ohio home, I could see my sister Margaret standing barefoot near the staircase, one hand pressed against the banister like she needed it to stay upright. Her eyes found mine, and in that single look I understood what 20 years in the army had taught me better than any words could have. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Tom forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Rebecca," he said, blocking the doorway with his body, "this really isn't a good time." I looked past him at my sister. Then I looked back at him. "It is now. My name is Rebecca Carter. I am 52 years old, divorced, retired from the United States Army, and for most of my adult life I have preferred peace over attention. That surprises people sometimes. They think military women must be loud or hard or eager to prove something. I was never any of those things. I learned early that real strength does not need to announce itself. It listens. It watches. It remembers where the exits are. Tom never knew that about me. To him, I was just Margaret's quiet younger sister, the one who brought casseroles after surgeries, the one who helped set tables at Thanksgiving, the one who smiled politely when he corrected everybody's stories at dinner. He never asked what I did before I moved back to our hometown. He never asked why I woke at 5 every morning, or why I noticed when a room grew tense, or why I could tell the difference between ordinary frustration and controlled fear. He assumed silence meant weakness. That was his first mistake. The message came at 6:12 on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a coffee mug when my phone buzzed on the counter. Margaret rarely texted at that hour. Tom liked dinner on the table by 6. That was one of those little rules nobody in the family talked about directly, but everyone somehow knew. I dried my hands on a dish towel and checked the screen. The message said, "Aunt June's blue teapot is cracked." For a moment I just stared at it. Then my whole body went still. Aunt June had been dead for 15 years. She never owned a blue teapot. And that sentence had only one meaning. Years earlier, after our mother fell in the bathroom and was too proud to call for help, Margaret and I made a private agreement. If either of us was ever in trouble but could not explain it openly, we would send a strange sentence no one else would understand. "Aunt June's blue teapot is cracked." It meant, "Come now, don't call first." I did not panic. Panic wastes time. I set the mug down, picked up my keys, slipped on my jacket, and walked out the door. Margaret lived 8 minutes away if the traffic light by the pharmacy turned green. That evening it did. The rain had started lightly tapping against my windshield as I drove through the streets of our small town, past the Methodist church, past the closed hardware store, past the diner where Margaret and I used to split pie after visiting our mother at the nursing home. All the ordinary places looked the same. That is how trouble often hides in American families. Behind mowed lawns, behind wreaths on front doors, behind men who shake hands firmly at church and remember everyone's birthday. By the time I pulled into Margaret's driveway, my mind had already begun organizing details. Tom's truck was there. Margaret's car was in the garage. Porch light on. Living room curtains closed. No music. No television glow from the front window. Their golden retriever Rusty was not barking. That last detail bothered me. Rusty always barked. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway. Old habits. Never block your own exit unless you have to. Then I walked to the porch and rang the bell. No answer. I rang again. This time I heard movement inside. A low male voice. A sharp whisper. Then footsteps. Tom opened the door only halfway. He wore a gray sweater, pressed slacks, and the expression of a man interrupted during something he did not want witnessed. "Rebecca," he said. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Margaret. She's resting." Behind him I saw Margaret shift slightly. Bare feet. No sweater. Her hair, usually brushed neat, hung loose around her face. "Margaret," I said gently. "You okay?" Tom moved an inch to block my view. "She's fine." I kept my voice calm. I asked her. His smile tightened. "You know, Rebecca, this is a private matter between husband and wife." There it was. The phrase men like Tom use when they want privacy to mean control. I did not step forward. Not yet. One of the first lessons I learned in uniform was that charging into a situation too fast can make it worse for the person you came to help. So I stood where I was, rain dampening my shoulders, and watched. Tom's right hand gripped the edge of the door too tightly. His jaw clenched every few seconds. Margaret's eyes were red. There was a small suitcase near the hallway closet, not fully packed. Just open, as if someone had started to leave and been stopped. My sister looked at me again. This time her lips moved soundlessly. Please. That one word nearly broke something in me. But I did not let it show. Tom leaned closer and lowered his voice. Go home, Rebecca. He meant it as a command. Maybe that worked on Margaret. Maybe it worked on his employees at the insurance office. Maybe it worked on our relatives who preferred not to get involved. It did not work on me. I took out my phone. Tom's eyes flicked down immediately. Good. He noticed. People reveal themselves in tiny reactions. I'm going to ask one more time, I said. Margaret, do you want me to come inside? Tom turned his head sharply. She doesn't know what she wants right now. My sister flinched. It was small. But I saw it. And in that moment, the old part of me, the part trained by 2 decades of service deployments, command rooms and emergencies where hesitation could cost lives, became very quiet. Very focused. I looked at Tom and said, move away from the door. He stared at me like he had never heard my voice before. Maybe he hadn't. Not the real one. For 30 years he had mistaken my kindness for softness, my manners for fear, my silence for permission. But he was about to learn something Margaret had always known. I did not come there to argue. I came because my sister called for help, and I was not leaving without her. Tom stepped aside. Not because I intimidated him. Not because he suddenly respected me. He stepped aside because he believed he was still in control. People who control others often make the same mistake. They think control is permanent. They think the story they're telling everyone is the only story that matters. And they think nobody is paying attention. Tom had spent years building that illusion. The problem was I had spent 20 years learning how to see through them. As I walked into the house, Margaret's shoulders visibly relaxed. Only slightly, but enough for me to notice. The smell of burnt meatloaf lingered in the kitchen. A dining chair sat tipped slightly away from the table. A wine glass rested untouched near the sink. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm a stranger. Everything that would concern someone trained to read environments. Tom closed the door behind me. I think this is getting blown out of proportion. There it was. The first rule of every controlling person. Minimize. Make the other person question what they saw. Question what they felt. Question themselves. I took off my raincoat, hung it carefully by the door, then looked at Margaret. Would you like some tea? Her eyes widened slightly. The question surprised her, because it wasn't really about tea. It was about choice. And after years of having choices slowly taken away, even small ones matter. Yes, she said quietly. Tea sounds nice. Tom sighed dramatically. Rebecca, for heaven's sake. I ignored him. Margaret and I walked into the kitchen together. For a few minutes we moved through familiar motions. Kettle, tea bags, mugs, simple things, ordinary things. Sometimes ordinary things help people feel safe enough to speak. Tom remained in the living room, watching television, or pretending to. His volume was louder than necessary. That told me he wanted us to know he was listening. Another detail. Another piece of information. By the time the tea was ready, Margaret's hands had stopped shaking. Not completely, but noticeably. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten birthday cake after Mom's 70th birthday. The same table where we'd laughed over family stories for decades. The same table where something had clearly changed. I waited. People tell the truth when they're ready, not when you're impatient. Finally, Margaret looked down at her cup. I didn't know who else to call. The sentence nearly broke my heart. Not because she called me, because she felt she had so few options. You did the right thing. She nodded, then stared out the window. Rain continued falling softly outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, Do you remember when you came home after Iraq? I smiled faintly. Which time? She laughed softly. The first genuine sound I'd heard from her all evening. My goodness. I leaned back. It's been a while. 20 years in the army. Most people hear that and imagine action movies. Explosions. Heroics. Adventure. The reality is much quieter. Long deployments. Leadership. Responsibility. Watching people carefully. Learning how fear changes behavior. Learning how stress changes communication. Learning how power changes relationships. Especially power. That's the lesson most civilians underestimate. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes emotional. Sometimes social. Sometimes it's simply convincing someone they can't manage without you. I had seen all of those. Not only overseas. At home, too. Margaret stirred her tea. Tom always thought you were—" She hesitated. "Gentle," I smiled. "I am gentle." She laughed again. "Not the way he means it. Number. Not the way he meant it." To Tom, gentle meant harmless. Predictable. Easy to dismiss. He never asked about my career. Never asked what rank I retired at. Never asked why local police officers occasionally greeted me by name. Never asked why veterans at community events naturally deferred to me. Because none of that fit the role he'd assigned me. Quiet sister-in-law. Helpful aunt. Background character. People see what they expect to see. And Tom expected very little. Around 8 o'clock, he finally entered the kitchen. His expression looked calmer. Practiced. Controlled. I think we've all had a stressful evening. There it was again. The attempt to reset reality. To move forward without discussing what happened. Margaret immediately lowered her eyes. I noticed. Tom noticed too. And that told me everything. You know, he continued, marriage is complicated. I nodded. It is. His face brightened slightly. He thought I was agreeing with him. I wasn't. Which is why respect matters so much. The brightness disappeared. Just for a second. But I saw it. Margaret saw it too. Tom pulled out a chair, sat down, crossed his arms. Respect goes both ways. Another common phrase. Perfectly reasonable on the surface. Often used to avoid accountability. Absolutely. I kept my voice calm. Which is why Margaret deserves it. Silence. Heavy silence. Tom stared at me, trying to decide something. Trying to understand why this conversation wasn't following its usual script. Because normally people backed down. Normally people accepted his explanations. Normally people chose comfort over truth. I didn't. Not because I was brave. Because I loved my sister. And because I had spent too many years watching what happens when good people stay silent. The conversation ended politely. Almost suspiciously politely. Tom eventually returned to the living room. Margaret walked me to the door. As soon as we were out of his hearing range, she whispered, "He's been controlling everything." There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not one bad argument. Everything. My stomach tightened. But my voice remained steady. "How long?" Her eyes filled with tears. Longer than I realized. That answer frightened me most. Because emotional control rarely starts dramatically. It grows slowly. Year by year. Decision by decision. Until the person living inside it can no longer see the walls. I squeezed her hand. "You're not alone anymore." She nodded, then surprised me. "You figured it out quickly." I smiled sadly. "No." I looked back toward the house. Toward the man watching television. Toward the marriage that clearly held more secrets than either of us had yet uncovered. I think I just recognized the pattern. As I drove home through the rain, one thought stayed with me. Tom still believed this was a disagreement. A family misunderstanding. An overprotective sister interfering. He didn't realize something important. I wasn't investigating because of one text. I was investigating because of what happened after the text. The fear in Margaret's eyes. The flinch. The hesitation. The exhaustion. Those things don't appear overnight. They come from years. And something told me years were exactly what I was about to uncover. The next few weeks changed the way I looked at my sister's marriage. Not because I discovered one shocking secret. Because I discovered dozens of small ones. That's the thing most people misunderstand about emotional control. They imagine screaming matches, broken dishes, police cars, visible bruises. Sometimes those things happen, but often the damage is much quieter and much harder to recognize, especially for the person living inside it. 3 days after receiving Margaret's distress message, I invited her to breakfast. Nothing unusual, just two sisters meeting at a small diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where the waitresses know your name and refill your coffee before you ask. Tom almost didn't let her come. That fact alone told me plenty. Margaret called me the night before. "I don't know if tomorrow will work." "Why not?" A pause. Then, "Tom thinks we already talked enough." I stared at the phone. Two sisters having breakfast required permission. That wasn't normal. Yet Margaret said it like she was discussing the weather, as though she no longer heard how strange it sounded. Eventually she came anyway. When she walked into the diner, she looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's posture. She sat across from me and smiled. But the smile faded quickly. For a while we talked about harmless things. Neighbors. Weather. Church. The garden she was trying to grow. Then I asked a simple question. "When was the last time you spent money without discussing it with Tom first?" She blinked. The question seemed to surprise her. "I don't know." Think about it. She stirred her coffee. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, she laughed softly. I honestly can't remember. That answer bothered me. Not because married couples shouldn't discuss finances. Healthy couples do. The problem was that Margaret didn't seem to have access to her own decisions anymore. I changed directions. When was the last time Tom asked your opinion before spending money? This time she answered immediately. He doesn't have to. Why? Because he handles finances. I nodded slowly. Another piece of the puzzle. Later that week, I visited her house again. Tom was at work. For the first time, Margaret seemed more relaxed. We sat on her back patio watching birds gather near a feeder. The afternoon was peaceful. Then something happened. A delivery truck pulled into the driveway. The driver carried a package to the front porch. Margaret immediately stood up. I need to call Tom. I looked at her. For a package, she froze, as if she suddenly hurt herself. Then she sat back down. And for the first time I saw embarrassment in her eyes. That's not normal, is it? The question nearly broke my heart. Because when adults have to ask whether ordinary behavior is normal, something has already gone wrong. No, I said gently. No, Margaret? She looked away. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then the stories started coming. Small stories. Not dramatic ones. Stories that sounded harmless individually. Together, they painted a different picture. Tom reviewed every bank statement. Tom disliked her seeing certain friends. Tom criticized purchases he considered unnecessary. Tom preferred knowing where she was. Tom questioned phone calls. Tom disliked surprises. Tom disliked disagreements. Tom disliked being challenged. Every sentence began with Tom. By the end of the afternoon, I realized something important. Margaret's world had become smaller, year after year, choice after choice, until she barely noticed. A week later, I attended a church fundraiser. Tom was there, smiling, shaking hands, telling stories. Everybody loved him. And honestly, I understood why. Tom wasn't a monster. That would have made things easier. Monsters are obvious. Tom was charming, helpful, reliable, the sort of man neighbors trusted, the sort of man community leaders praised, the sort of man who knew exactly how to appear reasonable. That's what made him dangerous. Not cruelty. Credibility. People rarely believe emotional control when the controller looks kind. At one point he approached me. Rebecca. Tom? He smiled. Margaret seems better. Interesting choice of words. Not happier. Better. As though she had been malfunctioning. She's enjoying spending time with family. The smile tightened slightly. Family can sometimes complicate things. I met his eyes. Family can also notice things. The smile disappeared completely, only for a second. Then it returned. Polished. Professional. Controlled. But I'd seen the crack. And more importantly, he knew I'd seen it. That evening, I wrote down everything I'd observed. Old military habit. Facts. Not emotions, facts. Patterns become clearer when written down. Over the next 2 weeks, the list grew. Margaret no longer managed her own retirement account. Tom controlled access to certain financial records. Several friendships had faded because Tom found those people negative. Margaret frequently apologized before expressing opinions. She often looked at Tom before answering questions. That one bothered me most. People should not need permission to have thoughts. One Saturday, Margaret and I visited our mother's grave. Something we hadn't done together in years. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking farmland. Quiet. Peaceful. A place that encouraged honesty. As we stood there, Margaret suddenly began crying. Not loudly. Just tears slipping down her face. I don't know when I became this person. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. What person? She stared at the gravestone. The one who's afraid to upset everybody. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Painful. True. Because that's what emotional control often creates. Not fear of violence. Fear of conflict. Fear of disappointment. Fear of being considered difficult. Over time, people start surrendering pieces of themselves to avoid those feelings. Until one day they barely recognize what's left. As we walked back toward the car, Margaret said something that stayed with me. Do you know what scares me most? What? She looked down. I'm not sure I would have noticed if you hadn't come. That frightened me too. Because she was right. The distress code had not saved her from one bad night. It had interrupted a process that had been quietly unfolding for years. And now that I could finally see the pattern, I knew something else. Tom wasn't going to like what happened next. Because patterns create evidence. And evidence creates truth. I didn't set out to destroy Tom. That's important to understand. By the time people hear a story like this, they often assume there must be a villain and a hero. Life is rarely that simple. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. The revenge, if there was any, would come naturally once the truth had nowhere left to hide. The investigation began quietly. No accusations. No dramatic confrontations. No secret cameras. Just observation. Facts. Patterns. The same things that had guided me through 20 years in the Army. One of the most valuable lessons I learned during my service was that people tell you who they are long before they realize you're listening. The problem is that most people only pay attention to words. I pay attention to behavior. 2 weeks after visiting the cemetery with Margaret, I stopped by her house again. Tom was home. As soon as I walked through the door, I noticed a change in him. He was being overly pleasant. That sounds harmless. It wasn't. People who feel secure don't usually become dramatically nicer overnight. People who feel watched do. "Rebecca," he said warmly. "Good to see you." He offered coffee, asked about my garden, even complimented my haircut. Margaret looked almost confused. Apparently, she wasn't used to this version of him either. I accepted the coffee and smiled politely. Then I watched. Tom interrupted Margaret 6 times during a 40-minute conversation. I counted. Not because I was trying to. Because after the 3rd interruption, I became curious. Each interruption was subtle. Nothing rude. Nothing obvious. Just enough to redirect the conversation. Margaret would begin sharing an opinion. Tom would finish the thought. Correct a detail. Add context. Change the topic. Small things. But patterns live inside small things. That evening I wrote it down. 6 interruptions. 40 minutes. The next week I attended a neighborhood barbecue where Tom and Margaret were also invited. Again I observed. Again the same pattern appeared. Tom controlled every shared story. Every conversation. Every decision. At one point another woman asked Margaret about a recent weekend trip. Before she could answer, Tom answered for her. Margaret smiled. Everyone laughed. Nobody noticed. Except me. Because by then I knew what I was looking for. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Margaret called me. Not because of an emergency. Not because of the distress code. Because she wanted advice. "Rebecca." "Yes." "I found something." Her voice sounded nervous. Very nervous. An hour later, I was sitting at her kitchen table. A folder lay between us. Inside were financial statements. Retirement accounts. Credit card records. Investment documents. Nothing illegal. Nothing scandalous. But something was wrong. Margaret pointed to one account. I didn't know this existed. I looked closer. It was an investment account. Substantial. Far larger than I expected. "Tom manages it." "You're married." She nodded. "I know." The sadness in her voice was impossible to miss. Not anger. Sadness. Because she was beginning to understand how much of her own life had been happening without her participation. Over the next several hours, we reviewed documents together. The picture became clearer. Tom wasn't stealing money. That would have been easier. Instead, he controlled information. He decided what Margaret needed to know. What she didn't need to know. What was worth discussing. What wasn't. Control often hides behind competence. And Tom was very competent. That's why nobody questioned him. Including Margaret. For years. A week later, I met with Margaret's longtime friend Susan. Not secretly. Just for lunch. Susan had known my sister for nearly 25 years. I asked a simple question. "Have you noticed changes in Margaret?" Susan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked relieved. That reaction told me everything. Finally, she said, "I thought I was imagining it." The words hit hard. Because that's what happens around controlling personalities. People doubt their own observations. Susan explained that Margaret gradually stopped attending book club meetings. Stopped joining weekend outings. Stopped calling as often. When invited somewhere, she frequently said, "Tom doesn't think it's a good idea." Or, "Tom already made plans." Or, "Tom needs me home." One excuse sounds reasonable. 100 excuses tell a story. Another piece of the puzzle. Another confirmation. The following Sunday, something happened that changed everything. After church, Margaret and Tom were speaking with friends near the parking lot. I stood nearby, listening, watching. A woman complimented Margaret's flower garden. Before Margaret could respond, Tom laughed. "Oh, she gives herself too much credit. I do most of the work." Everyone chuckled. Margaret smiled politely, but I saw it. A flash in her eyes. Tiny, almost invisible. Hurt. Years earlier, I would have missed it. Now I didn't. Because once you recognize a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Tom wasn't controlling through threats. He controlled through erosion. Small dismissals, small corrections, small humiliations, small reductions, 1 grain at a time, until confidence slowly disappeared. That evening I sat on my porch watching the sunset. My notebook rested on the table beside me, pages filled with observations, dates, examples, patterns. Not because I needed evidence for a courtroom, because I needed certainty, and by then certainty had arrived. Margaret wasn't imagining things, neither was I. The situation was real. The damage was real. The question now was what to do about it. Then fate handed me something unexpected. 3 days later, Daniel, Tom, and Margaret's oldest son called me. We weren't especially close, but we'd always gotten along. His voice sounded hesitant. Aunt Rebecca. Hi, Daniel. I need to ask you something. I sat up straighter. What is it? There was a long pause. Then he said, Has something been going on with Mom? My heart skipped. Because if the children were beginning to notice the walls Tom had spent years building were starting to crack, and once cracks appear, the truth has a way of finding sunlight. The moment Daniel called me, I knew something had changed. Children notice more than parents think, even grown children, especially grown children. The difference is that adults often explain away what they see because the alternative feels too painful. If Daniel was asking questions, it meant he had finally reached the point where explanations no longer worked. What do you mean? I asked carefully. On the other end of the phone, he hesitated. The hesitation itself told me plenty. Finally, he said, Mom doesn't seem like herself anymore. I looked out across my backyard. The late afternoon sun was settling over the trees. For a moment, I thought about all the years Margaret had spent protecting Tom's reputation, and how lonely that must have been. What are you seeing? I asked. Another pause. Then the truth started coming. Small observations. The same kind I had been collecting. She apologizes constantly. She checks with Dad before answering questions. She barely sees her friends anymore. He sighed. And honestly, Aunt Rebecca, she seems nervous around him. There it was. Not proof. Recognition. Sometimes recognition is the beginning of everything. Have you talked to her? No. Why not? His answer was immediate. Because every time I try, Dad somehow ends up answering. I closed my eyes. Another pattern. Another piece. Another confirmation. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the time we hung up, Daniel sounded unsettled. Not angry. Confused. Which was understandable. Nobody wants to believe something is wrong inside the family they grew up admiring. A week later, his younger sister Emily called me too. The second child. The peacemaker. The one who hated conflict. Aunt Rebecca. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded shaky. Can I ask you something? Of course. Is Mom okay? The exact same question. 2 children. Same concern. Same conclusion. Neither of them knew about the distress code. Neither knew about my conversations with Margaret. Yet both had arrived at the same place. That mattered. Very much. A few days later, Daniel invited everyone to dinner. The entire family. Tom, Margaret, Emily, a few cousins, even Karen, Margaret's closest friend. The invitation sounded innocent enough, but I suspected something else was happening. And when Daniel called privately afterward, he confirmed it. I think we need to talk as a family. I knew what that meant. The reckoning had arrived. The dinner took place on a Saturday evening. Daniel and his wife hosted. The dining room was warm and welcoming. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh rolls. The kind of meal that reminds people of childhood. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Almost painfully normal. People laughed, shared stories, talked about sports, talked about grandchildren, talked about retirement. Tom was charming, as always, telling stories, making people laugh, owning the room. Watching him, I understood why Margaret's situation had remained hidden so long. Because Tom wasn't difficult all the time. That would have been obvious. The problem was that he was only difficult when nobody was paying attention. That kind of behavior survives for years. Then the conversation shifted, slowly, naturally, toward family, toward aging, toward relationships. Daniel set down his fork. Dad, Tom looked up. Yeah, when was the last time Mom spent a weekend away with her friends? The room grew slightly quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Tom smiled. I don't know. Margaret lowered her eyes. Daniel continued. Can you remember? Tom laughed. What kind of question is that? The laughter sounded forced. For the first time all evening. Daniel didn't laugh. Neither did Emily. And suddenly I realized they had compared notes. That explained everything. Emily leaned forward. Mom hasn't taken a trip with friends in years. Tom shrugged. She's not interested. Nobody spoke. Then Karen cleared her throat. Actually, she used to love those trips. Tom's smile tightened. Only slightly. The old pattern appeared immediately. Dismiss. Redirect. Control. People change. Karen nodded slowly. Sometimes. The room became very quiet. Tom looked uncomfortable now. Not because anybody was attacking him. Because people were finally paying attention. Margaret sat perfectly still. Her hands folded in her lap. I could almost feel the battle happening inside her. Fear. Relief. Hope. Guilt. 30 years of marriage doesn't unravel easily. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He reached into a folder beside his chair and placed several papers on the table. The room froze. Tom stared. What is this? Daniel's voice remained calm. Financial records. Every instinct in Tom's body changed at once. I saw it immediately. His posture stiffened. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. The confidence disappeared. Not completely, but enough. Why are you showing those? Daniel looked directly at him. Because Mom didn't know about some of these accounts. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Tom looked toward Margaret, then toward me, then back toward the papers. The trap had finally closed. Not because I created it, because the truth had. Emily spoke next. Quietly, almost sadly. Mom shouldn't be afraid to ask questions about her own finances. Tom opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed unsure what to say. The room waited. Finally, he found his voice. This is ridiculous. Nobody responded. Not even Margaret. That silence frightened him more than any argument could have. Because arguments can be defeated. Silence often means people are thinking. And thinking people become difficult to control. Then came the moment everything changed. Margaret lifted her head, looked directly at her husband, and spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly, Tom. He turned toward her. I've spent years believing I was the problem. The room stopped breathing. I don't believe that anymore. No shouting followed. No dramatic scene. Just truth. Simple. Quiet. Impossible to ignore. And for the first time in decades, Tom looked like a man who realized he was losing control of the story. After Margaret spoke, nobody rushed to fill the silence. And that silence said more than any argument could have. Tom looked around the table. At Daniel. At Emily. At Karen. At me. Then finally back at Margaret. For years he had controlled conversations by speaking first, speaking longest, and speaking with confidence. That strategy only works when people are willing to surrender the room. Tonight nobody was surrendering anything. Margaret, he said carefully, you know that's not true. His voice sounded calm, reasonable, almost concerned. To someone hearing only those words, he would have sounded like a loving husband trying to understand a misunderstanding. But I wasn't listening to the words. I was watching my sister. Margaret flinched. Not physically, emotionally. The reaction was almost invisible. But after 20 years of reading people under stress, I saw it immediately. Tom saw it too. That was why he'd used that tone. The familiar tone. The reassuring tone. The one that usually brought her back into line. This time it didn't work. Margaret sat straighter. I do know it's true. Nobody moved. Daniel stared at his mother. I don't think he'd ever heard her speak that firmly to his father before. Neither had Emily. Tom forced a laugh. A small one. Where is this coming from? The old strategy. Make the concern seem sudden. Make the concern seem irrational. Make the concern seem borrowed from someone else. His eyes shifted toward me. There it was. The blame. Not spoken, but present. Rebecca poisoned the well. Rebecca influenced Margaret. Rebecca created this. I met his gaze calmly. Tom looked away first. That surprised him. It surprised me a little too. Because for the first time he wasn't facing the version of me he had invented. He was facing the real one. And he didn't know what to do with her. Daniel spoke next. Dad? Tom looked at him. When did Mom stop having access to the investment account? The question landed like a hammer. Not because it was aggressive. Because it was specific. Specific questions are dangerous. They require specific answers. Tom shifted in his chair. I manage our finances. That's not what I asked. The room went quiet again. Daniel had inherited more of Margaret's kindness than Tom's confidence, which made moments like this rare and powerful. Tom's voice hardened slightly. Someone has to. Margaret looked down. Emily spoke immediately. Mom is perfectly capable. Tom turned toward her. That's not what I meant. But everybody knew exactly what he'd meant. For years, people had accepted those little comments, those little reductions, those little assumptions. Now they sounded different. Once a pattern becomes visible, it's difficult to unsee. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Nobody shouted. Nobody accused. Nobody insulted. And somehow that made it more devastating. Because truth doesn't always need volume. Eventually, Daniel asked the question that changed everything. "Dad, why does Mom seem afraid to disagree with you?" Tom froze. Only briefly. But long enough. The room noticed. Every person at that table noticed. And suddenly all the little observations people had quietly collected over the years began connecting. The interrupted conversations. The canceled plans. The apologies. The hesitation. The self-doubt. The shrinking world. For decades they had existed separately. Now they formed a picture. Tom saw it happening. I could tell. Because panic had finally arrived. Not visible panic. The controlled version. The kind, successful people display when they're losing control, but still trying to appear composed. He stood up, walked to the window, looked outside, then turned back. "I've spent 30 years taking care of this family." The statement was true. That was the difficult part. Controlling people often build their control around truths. Tom had worked hard, provided financially, supported his children, loved his family in many ways. None of that erased the damage. Margaret stood too. Slowly, carefully. "I know." Her voice trembled. But she continued. "I've spent 30 years taking care of this family too." Nobody spoke. Tears filled Emily's eyes. Daniel stared at the table. Tom looked genuinely shocked. Not because Margaret disagreed, because she had finally claimed her own contribution. People underestimate how powerful that moment can be, especially after years of being overlooked. Then Margaret looked at me, and I knew what was coming. The distress code. The thing nobody else in the room knew. "Rebecca." I nodded. Margaret swallowed hard. "Tell them." For a moment I considered refusing. The code had always been private. But this wasn't about privacy anymore. It was about truth. So I told them. I explained the message. The agreement we'd made years earlier. The phrase that meant, "Come now. Don't call first. I need help." Daniel's face went pale. Emily covered her mouth. Tom stared at me. Then at Margaret. Then back at me. For the first time all evening, he looked completely lost. "When did you send it?" Margaret answered. "The night Rebecca came over." Tom's voice dropped. "You sent a distress code." The pain in that question surprised me. Because for the first time he wasn't angry. He was wounded. Finally understanding how frightened and isolated his wife had become. And perhaps understanding his role in creating it. Margaret nodded. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. Nobody moved. Nobody rushed to comfort anyone. Some truths need room. This was one of them. Several minutes later, Tom sat down heavily. Older somehow. Smaller. Not defeated. Just confronted. Confronted by reality. The conversation continued late into the night. Painful. Honest. Necessary. By the time it ended, no miracles had occurred. No perfect apologies. No dramatic redemption. Real life rarely works that way. But one thing had changed. Margaret made a decision. The following week, she moved into a small apartment across town. Not permanently. Not yet. Just space, time, room to breathe. And for the first time in years, the entire family supported her choice. As people began gathering coats and preparing to leave, Tom stopped beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "How long did you know?" I looked at him. The night I received the text. His shoulders dropped. A sad smile crossed his face. "I spent 30 years thinking you were harmless." I returned the smile. Not unkindly. "That was your second mistake." 6 months later, I was standing in Margaret's kitchen watching her burn a batch of blueberry muffins. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the oven mitt. And for a moment, I simply stood there smiling. Not because the muffins were ruined. Because my sister was laughing again. Really laughing. The kind of laughter that comes from peace. The kind that had been missing for years. Her apartment wasn't fancy. A small 2-bedroom place on the edge of town. A second-floor unit overlooking a pond where geese gathered every morning. The furniture didn't match. The curtains were temporary. The walls still looked a little empty. But the apartment contained something that had been absent from her life for a long time. Freedom. Not dramatic freedom. Ordinary freedom. The freedom to choose what to eat. When to leave. Who to call. What to spend. How to spend a Saturday afternoon. Small freedoms. The kind most people never notice until they're gone. As I carried the ruined muffins to the trash, Margaret opened the window. Fresh autumn air drifted inside. Remember when Mom tried to make pumpkin bread and forgot the sugar? I laughed. She blamed the recipe for 3 years. Margaret smiled. No matter how obvious the truth was. The comment lingered between us. Neither of us mentioned Tom. Neither of us needed to. Because that had been the lesson for all of us. Sometimes the truth sits in front of people for years. And everyone keeps finding reasons not to see it. A few weeks after moving into the apartment, Margaret began reconnecting with old friends. The book club returned. Lunches with Karen returned. Phone calls returned. Even her confidence began returning. Slowly. Not all at once. Healing rarely works that way. Some mornings she felt strong. Other mornings she doubted herself. That was normal. 30 years leaves a mark. But every month seemed a little better than the one before. One afternoon she showed me something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. A plane ticket. "What's that?" She grinned. "Charleston." I blinked. "You're traveling?" "I am." "When?" "Next month." I laughed. "You hate traveling." "No." She shook her head. I thought I hated traveling. That distinction mattered. How many things had Margaret convinced herself she disliked simply because someone else disliked them? How many preferences had quietly disappeared over the years? Neither of us knew. But she was beginning to find out. Tom's journey was slower. And more complicated. Many people expect stories like this to end with punishment, with humiliation, with complete destruction. Real life rarely works that way. At least not when people are willing to face themselves honestly. Tom entered counseling. Not immediately, not enthusiastically, but eventually. Daniel told me it took weeks, perhaps months. At first, Tom blamed stress, then retirement planning, then communication problems, then family interference. Only later did he begin examining his own behavior. The process wasn't easy. Several conversations became uncomfortable. Several truths became impossible to avoid. But something unexpected happened. Tom listened. Not perfectly, not consistently, but genuinely. For a man who had spent decades believing he always knew best, that was significant. The family noticed. Margaret noticed. I noticed. One Sunday afternoon, nearly half a year after the distress code, the entire family gathered for lunch. Not because anybody forced it. Because everyone wanted to. The atmosphere felt different. Lighter. Honest. People spoke more freely. Margaret interrupted Tom twice. And nobody died. Emily nearly laughed when it happened. Daniel looked relieved. Tom looked surprised. Then amused. Progress sometimes arrives in strange forms. After lunch, Tom asked if he could speak with me privately. We walked onto the back porch. Leaves drifted across the yard. Children played in a neighboring driveway. The world continued doing ordinary things. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Tom sighed. "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. His expression was sincere. Uncomfortable. But sincere. "You don't owe me anything." "Actually, I do." He leaned against the railing. "I spent years thinking I understood people." I smiled slightly. "You were pretty confident about it." He laughed. A genuine laugh. That's one way to describe it. Then his face grew serious. "I underestimated you." There it was. The sentence the entire story had been moving toward. Not because I wanted recognition. Because understanding matters. Tom continued. "I thought you were just..." He stopped, searching for the right word. "Quiet," I offered. He nodded. "Exactly." I smiled. "I am quiet." He shook his head. "No." Then he corrected himself. "You're calm." That difference mattered. Very much. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is strength under control. The army taught me that. Life confirmed it. Tom looked out across the yard. Margaret needed someone to pay attention. I didn't answer. Because he was finally saying the truth out loud. And sometimes people deserve the dignity of reaching it themselves. A few minutes later he added, "Thank God she had you." For the first time since this began, I believed he meant it. That evening, after everyone left, Margaret and I sat together watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange over the pond outside her apartment. For a while, we simply enjoyed the silence. Then she smiled. "You know what still amazes me?" "What?" She looked at me. 10 minutes. I laughed softly. 10 minutes. The time between a strange text message and a knock on her front door. The time between isolation and support. The time between suffering alone and knowing someone was coming. 10 minutes. Sometimes a life changes that quickly. And sometimes it changes because someone cared enough to pay attention. If you've listened this far, I hope you'll remember something important. Not every cry for help sounds dramatic. Not every struggle leaves visible scars. Sometimes the people who need support are smiling at family dinners, sitting beside us at church, or answering the phone with the same cheerful voice they've always used. Pay attention. Ask questions. Listen carefully. And if someone you love reaches out even in a small way, don't ignore it. You may become the reason they find their way back to themselves. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, family dignity, and second chances, we'd be honored to have you join us again. Thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of yourself, and take care of each other.